Regrettably, I'm about to cause trouble. Written and narrated by Amie McNee. Chapter 28. I sat on the bed. It was morning, but we had only just got to our rooms. Hildy had got a damp cloth and was blotting my neck and face. They were concerned about me, to say the least. But I did not want to discuss the nudity. I wanted to discuss the king's request. What the fuck is wrong with these people? Rufus was pacing, visibly upset. I am well, Rufus, I am well. We need to talk about what the king wants from me. And the king, said Zita, throwing her hands in the air. All over you. I'm surprised he didn't take you to his bedchambers. On your first trip to court, Hildy tutted. I've never seen them all like that. Zita was undressing in a rage. Oh, but just looking at you standing there, Maude, totally exposed. I was angry now. Far worse has happened to me, Zita, I snapped. I am not a child anymore. I am a witch. I can handle these things. Her bright blue eyes finally stilled upon my own. Of course you can, she whispered. The king has asked something of me that I fear is more terrible than my naked body. What? Said Rufus, very quickly. He's not asking me to fuck him, Rufus. He wants me to join the Queen's ladies. He wants me to tell him whether Her Majesty is a witch. There was a pause. She almost undoubtedly is, said Hildy. That wasn't what I had been expecting. What? I signed quickly. She can't be, how do you know? She is otherworldly, connected to spirits unknown for cert. You didn't feel it when you were near her? Hildy asked, surprised. She's guarded, I shrugged. For a reason, said Zita. Jesus Christ, I thought he was being facetious. Just tell him she isn't a witch, Maude, it can't be that hard. He is looking for one answer. He wants a divorce. Another one? Rufus asked. You cannot out her as a witch. Verily, the king will find another way to divorce her. In return for my services, he will let Rufus return with us. I had been nervous to reveal this. I wondered if Rufus would be angry. Maybe he didn't want to come home. What? He seemed confused. The king asked what I wanted in return for this service. His expression was unreadable. I said your name. I asked for your freedom from court. Silence. But I'm sure you can stay if you want to. He was not happy about letting you go. He had cocked his head to one side. I couldn't read the expression on his face. You should have asked him before you made this arrangement, Maude, Zita said sternly. You should have asked the witches. Rufus spoke softly. I have already taken up their hospitality too long. Nonsense, tutted Hildy. We would welcome you back. Forgive me, Rufus. I should have asked you what it was you desired. I thought only of myself. It was all I yearned for when he asked me what I wanted. I swallowed, not able to look him in the eye. Why would I confess to that? There was an awkward pause. You have no choice but to join the Queen's court. Zita was back to the pressing topic at hand. Stay quiet, out of sight. We will have to play it by ear. I fear my mother will be there. Oh, Christ. She sat heavily on the bed. We shouldn't have brought her, Hildy. We should have left her at home with the shop. Do not speak like this, Zita. I am perfectly able to deal with these situations. I'm just tired and looking for support. But if all you're going to do is treat me like a child, then I'm going to bed. I left their room and shut my door heavily. Then I threw all my dresses onto the floor and quickly tucked myself into bed, freezing. I shook from anger and the cold. I waited for sleep to descend. Surely I was exhausted. After a few moments, the door opened. It was Rufus. I watched him as he tried to creep quietly into the room, so tall, so broad, so unfairy-like. The ceilings in this kingdom were at least a foot too low for him. He looked at me and realized I was awake. We looked at each other for a long time, my shivering exacerbated from nerves now. Are you shaking with anger at the witches? He asked. Nay, I paused. I am shaking because I am afraid I have upset you and also because it is cold. I acted selfishly, without considering your feelings. You are always very thoughtless. I know. You think only of yourself. I know. Do you need another blanket? There are no more, I chattered. Are you clothed under there? I shook my head. Where are your night clothes? In the other room. Do you want me to fetch them? No. You are too stubborn, he muttered. The shivering was uncontrollable now. Rufus pursed his lips, took an audible inhale and then an audible exhale. Then he took off his shoes, walked behind me, and lay on top of the covers. He put his arms around my body and rested his chin over my head. He was so warm. I shuffled closer into him. "Is this better?" I turned my body to face him. "Aye." He looked at me with those unreadable eyes. "I'm sorry for not asking you what you wanted. I will endeavour to never be so unthinking ever again." He raised a sceptical eyebrow. I was no longer tired. "I thought it would please you." "It pleases me to have a choice. Do not worry yourself about it." He brushed his nose against my own. "Just like you English to be bargaining for this poor black man's future." My stomach flipped over. His expression was playful, and he was winding me up, but I felt nearly nauseated by the truth he had told. "Forgive me," I whispered, and again he brushed his nose against my own. There was silence for some time. Then I gathered my courage. "I would hear some of your stories from where you're from if you ever wanted to share them." "I have no memories of my homeland. My first is of the boat that brought us over." "What was it like?" "It will ruin your sleep." "If you wanted to tell the story, I would sacrifice my sleep." "Well, let me see. What are the highlights?" His face was an inch from mine. "I recall my kinsmen got so sick they looked like white men. I remember sitting in my own vomit. I remember the rocking. I had to shit into my own clothes, and my mother had to do the same. I remember my friends dying and being taken up on deck. I remember hearing the splashes of the sea and wondering if those splashes were the splashes of bodies. And then we were in Spain." I didn't move my face away from his, but I wanted to. I think he was relishing my discomfort. I wanted to squirm, to retreat, but I also wanted to touch his cheeks and hold his head to my breast. "Sounds shite," I muttered. "Verily, it was shite," he concluded. He moved his head forwards. He kissed my forehead gently. I wanted to return the gesture, but I couldn't find the courage. Jane the Fool retrieved me at about midday. She wore a pearl-adorned gable, and the triangular frame around her perfectly round face looked almost comical. "I will take care of you," she said kindly, linking arms with me. "Thank you, Jane." "The Queen won't like you because she'll think you're a spy." "I know." "You are a spy." It wasn't a question. "Do you think I should stay silent, out of sight?" She nodded dramatically, her gable bouncing up and down precariously. "Yes," she said, very excited that I knew what to do. "That's an excellent idea." The court was still quiet, people resting their weary heads. The day itself was a delight. The air was cool, but the sun shone generously down upon me. Not even the glorious weather could rile this court of slugger beds. We crossed the clock tower court and went into the Queen's gallery. Oh God. I stopped, my mind choosing now of all the time to start processing what was unfolding. Zounds, this was the day I'd dreamt of, the day I'd sat in waiting for my first 18 years, the day I became one of the women. In waiting. Jane gently coaxed me forwards. The guard opened the door into a drawing room. It was smaller than the room King Henry had been entertaining in last night, but it was similarly furnished and the floors and walls were covered in tapestry. It was homey and pleasant, perfect for a day such as today. The Queen's ladies decorated the room, much like the women strewn over the King's rooms the previous night, but these ones glittered with jewels, and there was not a breast in sight. I saw my mother immediately, sitting in the corner of the far room, hidden in shadow. She had moved violently when I entered. I wonder what had happened to my newest brother, if he was alive and well. He would be with a wet nurse, I supposed. And then, of course, I saw the Queen. She sat on a stool, glittering in candlelight. She was stitching. "Thank you, Jane," she said without looking up. Jane curtsied. "You're welcome, Anne." I looked around, deeply surprised she had used the Queen's first name. No one else had flinched. Everyone but the Queen and my mother was watching me. "This is wise woman Maude," said the Queen, still finishing off a stitch. "She is a fortune-teller and a witch. She will be here to entertain us throughout the festive period. A gift from my husband." I dipped into a deep curtsy. "Maude, you will entertain yourself and remain quiet unless I, or any of my ladies, request your services." "Yes, Your Majesty." "What do you think of her, Jane?" Anne asked. I looked up from my curtsy. Jane was standing by Her Majesty's side. "I think she is a spy." "God damn it, Jane." "I think so too," said Anne, not perturbed. "But I do not think she wants to be one." I stared at them both. Neither seemed angry or upset with me. "You do not need to pretend you are anything but a spy, Maude," she smiled. "Jane is connected to the heavens. She knows all." I didn't say anything. "I'm sorry my husband has put you in this position. I can imagine it was not what you intended to do over your festive season." Was this a big old trick? What the fuck was I meant to say? "You do not need to say anything for now." I exhaled. "Can you stitch?" I nodded. "Good. Join us." "Lady Mary." Christ, my mother stood. "Your Majesty." "Fetch Maude all she needs. Maude, you may sit over there." She pointed to a spare stool. I went and sat. I stared into my lap. "Here." Hands appeared in front of my face. It is peculiar how well you know your kin's hands. I recognized the length of her fingers, the lightly freckled skin, the rings. I looked up. My mother was handing me needles, thread, and cloth. "Thank you." Our hands brushed as I gathered my things. She didn't look me in the eye. It took me mere moments to remember how much I hated stitching. God, I was bad. It was silent except for the sporadic tinkle of me dropping my poxed needle. I had, yet again, made a rose with far too big thorns for the size of its petals. I sighed. "Were you in the king's chambers last night, Maude?" I jumped. It had been quiet for so long. A few titters and whispers, but no one had spoken out loud. "She was," said Jane loudly. "I was, Your Majesty," I repeated. All 10 of the women's eyes were on me. "What was it like?" I looked into Anne's eyes from across the room. She cradled her stomach. Henry hadn't told me not to tell her. He told me to spy. It would probably only gain her trust to be honest about the situation. "It was Dionysian, Your Majesty." Titters and shaking of the heads. Anne remained still. "How many whores were there?" "Surely over a dozen, Your Majesty." "Any woman of the court?" The air in the room changed. It was harder to breathe. Or perhaps it was entirely unbreathable air. Either way, no one dared take a breath. I looked around the room, seeing if I recognized anyone's face. Yes, she had been there. The woman looked the worse for wear, and her eyes boggled at me, begging me not to betray her. "Were you harmed?" Anne asked before I could reply. She must have seen my eyes linger. She knew who I had seen. The air became breathable again. I was touched by this question. "There was a trying moment, Your Majesty, but I was left physically unharmed." "I hope none of the men violated you." There were several gasps. I hoped one of them might be my mother. "They did not." "Did the king seem to be entertaining anyone in particular?" "In all truth, Your Majesty, the only person I saw him with was Lord Seymour." To my surprise, the air was poison again. "Edward Seymour?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Did you hear anything of what they discussed?" "His Majesty wanted me to read Lord Seymour." "What did you see in him?" "Your Majesty, I hope you won't mind if I keep that to myself. It was personal business. I hope you understand. I would not ever betray a reading from you, and I wish to show that by example, by not betraying Lord Seymour." Anne nodded. "I respect that. What happened after the reading? Did they discuss anything further?" "He sent him away, Your Majesty." What a shame. I would have loved to have heard what he said. Perhaps you can enlighten us, Lady Seymour." I turned to see the small woman in the corner. "I do not know my brother's business, Your Majesty," she whispered. "Of course you don't." Vehement anger. That relationship was not a happy one. "Thank you, Maude. You may sit here." She pointed to the chair where my mother sat, by her side. "Mary, swap seats with Maude." My mother looked horrified. She didn't move. She just stared up at Anne. The Queen looked at her for a long time, cocking her head, as though trying to understand this bizarre reaction. "Mary," she said again. My mother got up and staggered over to my stool. My heart in my throat, I sat by the Queen's seat. "You're her favourite today," said Jane, too loudly. There was a knock on the door and a guard came through. "Your Majesty, it is time for the jousting tournament." "At what time does my husband ride?" Soon, I would think, Your Majesty. He is eager to get his joust in hand. He will undoubtedly want to impress you, Lady Seymour. Wear the necklace he gave you last night. Jane Seymour did not look up from her feet. Unfortunately, I am unwell. This babe exhausts me. She smiled around at all of us. You will all have to attend without me. Slowly, the women began collecting themselves. I was unsure what to do. You stay with me, Maude, said Anne quietly. In my mind's eye, I witnessed all her composure and all her kindness leaving the room with her ladies, leaving me with a monster with child. I had dealt with my mother's pregnant mood swings all of my life, and they were genuinely something to fear. Mary left last. She turned to look at me, and she made eye contact for the first time. I felt guilty, which felt unfair. The door shut, and there was a long silence. Lady Jane was still there too. Is Lady Mary your mother? I stared at the door, unable to move my eyes from it. I was frozen in this time and this place forever. My body was immovable, my mind fixated on what she had just said. How could she know? She turned to her fool. Jane, I want you to enjoy the joust too. You are to leave. Aye, Your Majesty. Jane left, content and at ease. Still staring at the door through which Jane had just left, I tried to take a breath. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry to surprise or upset you. The touch removed me from my reverie. I got off my stool and fell into a curtsy at her feet, my skirts pooling around me. How could you know that, Your Majesty? I managed. I've never seen Mary behave in that way. Something about the way she looked at you. I just knew. Will you reveal this to the court? Not if you don't want me to. I nodded, extremely grateful. I am indebted to you, Your Majesty. What did you read in my eyes last night? I looked up at her again. I was hit with a cart of lethargy. Your Majesty, I don't want to tell you. If you truly are a witch, nothing you say will be news to me. I looked at her for a long time. I think she knew what I saw. I saw sadness, Your Majesty. We are all sad in some way or other. I saw fear. Everyone fears, Maude. Are you a fraud or a seer? I saw fear over the life of your child. Over Elizabeth? No. Her hands went to her stomach. Are you bleeding? Is something amiss with the babe? Oh God, the silence went forever. I do bleed, she whispered, but I bled in my pregnancy with Elizabeth. But this is more, I said. Yes. My kinswoman Hildy is a healer, known for her work with unborn babes. She is also discreet. A moment's pause. Will you fetch her? Of course, I rose. Not right now, she said quickly. What did Henry send you here for? I stared at the delicate necklace around her neck, a pearl necklace with the gold letter B at her throat. I'm scared, Your Majesty. I don't want to be punished for disloyalty. Nor do I, Maude, she said pointedly. He did not send me here to question your loyalty to him. He didn't. She seemed genuinely surprised. Then why? Will you tell him I betrayed him? You will not betray him. You will still spy on me. I will just know why. I ran my hands over my bodice, over my mark. He wonders if you are like me. A witch? Yes, Your Majesty. Huh. She sat back in her chair and stared into nothingness. I let her sit in her thoughts and tried to harness control over my breath. What do you think so far, Maude? I think you are a woman of power and intuition, Your Majesty. Does that make me a witch? Only if it gets in a man's way. She managed to laugh. How did you know that you were a witch? The world deemed me a witch because I have a mark on my belly, a large witch's mark. And your practice? Does it feel true to you? It didn't at first, but as I recognize my powers, they grow. I am a witch because I am sensitive, because I can feel people's feelings and emotions through my touch and through my eyes. I am powerful and intuitive. You saw my bleeding, she whispered. I did. She rubbed her forehead. How? I felt it, I shrugged. We both looked at each other for a long while. How did you know that Mary was my mother? I asked quietly. I felt it, she whispered.